The scientists didn't go over there to prove the shroud to be authentic. What they did prove is that it's not the work of an artist, and it could be authentic.
When it comes to the fact that it represents sort of our modern depictions of Jesus, that does kind of raise some red flags in my head. It's like, are we really supposed to expect that we actually got the image of Jesus perfect?
John becomes the first of the apostles to believe in the resurrection, and that belief is based on the evidence of the linen cloth lying there. Was that only for the benefit of Peter and John, or was it for the benefit of the whole world, throughout all generations? We have a tremendous body of data already collected on the shroud. I don't see that could be the fabrication of an artist.
The fact that we don't know what the mechanism is, that doesn't automatically mean it's a miracle. It just means that we don't know.
We have been bought, purchased, redeemed, ransom. Those are all words of transaction. The payment has been made on our behalf. So when Peter and John ran to the tomb and saw the linen cloth lying there, what did they see? They saw the record of the transaction. They saw the receipt. Maybe the shroud is a receipt, a document that says paid in full.
Welcome to Truth and Tradition. Today, I'm joined by Russ Breault, a leading expert on the Shroud of Turin, the cloth many believe to have wrapped the body of Jesus. Russ has spent decades studying this mystery and believes it to be the real deal. But is it? Might it more likely be a medieval forgery? And if so, how does it have photonegative and three-dimensional qualities? Why is there no artistic substances like paint, ink, or dye to be found on the cloth? And most interestingly, how on earth could this fabric have survived 2,000 years? Wow! Today, we continue our series discussing this mystery in hopes of finding out if this thing is truly authentic. In part 1, I went over a potential timeline for the Shroud of Turin from the perspective of someone who thinks it's genuine. You can watch that video by clicking here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel as we continue this series investigating Christianity's most studied artifact. Russ Breault, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Jackson. I appreciate you being able to be here.
Yes, it's very difficult to be on my own podcast, but I appreciate you being here for sure. The Shroud of Turin is definitely a very interesting topic. It's been studied for a very long time. People say it's the most studied artifact in human history. Can you just briefly describe what is the Shroud of Turin?
Well, shroud, meaning a burial cloth that has wrapped a corpse, of Turin, meaning Turin, Italy, where it's been kept ever since 1578. And prior to that, it was in France, and prior to that, it was in Turkey. But this is a 14-foot long linen cloth. So it's very long, but only 3.5 feet wide. And it bears the faint image of a bearded, crucified man, about 5'10" in height. And this image is inexplicable. I'll get to that in just a minute. But there also has a pattern of blood stains on the cloth that correlate with the wounds of crucifixion. But not just any crucifixion, specifically the crucifixion of Jesus as recorded in all 4 of the gospel accounts. And what I mean by that specifically would be over 30 puncture wounds around the head from an apparent crown of thorns, well over 100 whip marks, scourge marks all over the body from the whipping from the base of the neck all the way down to the ankles. And it's, then you have a wound in the side, because when the soldiers came back by, Jesus was already dead. They didn't break his legs. And you have nail wounds in the wrists, nail wounds in the feet. So the man's clearly crucified, but in terms of people would say, well, how do you know it's Jesus? Well, that's how you know. You do a forensic investigation and look at all of the unique attributes of how Jesus was crucified, and then realize that the shroud correlates with that, 100%. So the the question now, the shroud, as you said earlier, is the most studied artifact. In fact, thousands of hours of investigation have gone into this.
I was definitely surprised when I was getting into this because I figured, oh yeah, I'll look into this and get a little bit of understanding of what it is. And then I was reading research paper after research paper, and I was like, whoa, it's a very big project. And so much your whole channel's about the shroud. So you could make a whole career just studying the shroud alone. So it's amazing.
It's, like I said, it's the most analyzed artifact in the world. 33 American scientists had access to the cloth for 5 days, 120 hours, round the clock. They had over 70 crates of scientific gear that they brought over there. and they come away with basically one conclusion, and that is that the shroud is not the work of an artist. There's no visible trace of any kind of paint, ink, dye, pigmentation, stain on the cloth to account for the image. And the blood is blood. It's in fact, to be more specific, it is characterized as the exudate of actual wounds. And I can get further into the blood chemistry if you want, but it's very intriguing. And so the scientists didn't go over there to prove the shroud to be authentic. What they did prove is that it's not the work of an artist, and it could be authentic.
When you say it's not the work of an artist, we know that because there's like no pigments, there's no paint, there's no like strokes of anything sort of drawn on. People do speculate maybe there's other ways an artist could have done this. But when you say that, is that what you mean? Like that there's no sort of drawing, any sort of...
Well, when you analyze the reason the image is visible is that something has caused the accelerated dehydration and oxidation of the cellulose fibers composing the flax, which is the flax linen, but only in those areas immediately surrounding a body. And so now we're looking, also bear in mind that the image resides on only the top 1 to 2 microfibers, not threads. Each individual thread is made up of about 200 microfibers. So that means that this image resides on about 1% of a single thread wherever the image is visible. And this is uniform throughout the entire cloth, the entire front image, dorsal image. So this uniform superficiality is really, really astounding. And so in other words, when you look at the shroud, the first thing you'll see is the image lies in between these two parallel lines, which are just nothing more than burns and patches and scorch marks. And so that's the first thing you see is doused with water is a pattern of water stains. You have a pattern of blood stains. If you were to turn the cloth over, flip it over, you'd see all that, but you will not see the image of the man. The image of the man is a purely superficial phenomenon affecting only the uppermost, 1% of the fibers. Now, so what this tells you then is that the blood soaks all the way through. The image is purely superficial. So we have two different sets of images here, and I wouldn't call the blood images, but so also what's very intriguing is that there's no image under the blood, which tells us then that the blood somehow got under the cloth first, followed by the image, and which makes sense if it's authentic, because Good Friday followed by Easter Sunday, that makes sense, but it makes no sense as the work of an artist. So now we're going to look for somebody who's going to craft a whole pattern of bloodstains over the whole cloth and then try to fashion an image around it. That would be ridiculous. Why would you even try such a thing? Because that degree of realism was not necessary if you're just perpetrating a hoax.
We'll get back to the conversation in just a moment. But first, do you like coffee? I sure do. In fact, most days, coffee is the very thing that provides me with the energy to get these episodes out to all of you. If you enjoy these podcasts and would like to support the channel, you can send me a tip at buymeacoffee.com/truth_tradition. Also linked in the description down below. Here you can send me a one-time or reoccurring gift if you really love me. Let's keep things PG. You can also send me a custom message, which is greatly appreciated. That's buymeacoffee.com/truth_tradition or the link in the description down below. Cheers.
It's you wouldn't need that, that degree of realism, which brings us to the either or proposition with the shroud, and that it either is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus or it's not. And if it's not, then it must be the work of human effort somehow, some way, as a devotional art or as a fabulous hoax, one of the two. And it's and there's nothing in between. And so it really is, an astounding, artifact.
Yeah. I'm going to pull it up here real quick so we can kind of take a look at the image itself. So this is the image of it, just kind of standard lighting on it. There's several different versions of the shroud that we can look at. But here you can kind of see is the
frontal image up top. On the top, yep. You're looking at the frontal edge of him. He's kind of upside down, and then the dorsal image down below. And
then these parallel lines. That's not the shroud itself. That's the burn marks.
That's
correct.
Just burns and scorches and patches.
Yeah. So the Shroud of Turin, I believe it was 1532. It went through a fire. Which would have caused these. It was like in a box, and the silver from the box, it sort of melted and then hit onto the shroud while it was being contained.
It hit like a corner, and so it creates this kind of origami type burn pattern that we see. Yeah. It was folded in 16 layers. We have 16 burns, and it's that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, it's definitely got a fascinating history to it. You kind of mentioned this a little bit in your description of the Shroud of Turin earlier, but the thing that stuck out to me most when I was like researching this, because when you're first presented this, you probably think, oh yeah, that's just kind of created from maybe some of the gases like ammonium that comes from a decaying body, from blood. You would assume that it's created by some sort of mechanism that's like from a natural body that's decaying, that creates this sort of image. That, or if you don't believe it was, Jesus, then you would say, oh, well, it was actually a painting or something of that sort. But when you look into this a little bit more, you were mentioning this sort of dehydration, oxidization process that imprints the image onto the cloth itself, which to me shows that there's a lot more going on here than what first seems to be the case. There's something that is going on that beyond kind of what you would originally imagine. I kind of think that if the shroud's authentic, it doesn't just mean that Jesus was crucified. It also means that he rose from the dead, or something miraculous sort of happened to create the imprint onto the cloth. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more and explain what is the dehydration, the oxidization process? What are some of the ideas of like how the imprint of the image itself could have gotten onto the cloth?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've been doing a lot of things experimentally to try to replicate that. And, and it's really hard to do, especially because of the superficial nature. Now, the closest we've gotten to so far is some experiments that were done in Italy. Some Italian physicists had been experimenting with ultraviolet excimer lasers, and these are high power industrial lasers. Could blow a hole through a wall, and it's so and they determined that a microsecond burst on a UV laser against a control sample of linen achieves the very same depth and coloration as we see on the shroud. And I'm saying, no, that's a cool piece of data right there. I mean, so because, so are we, because we've done experiments with light, but have been unsuccessful. But this 40 nanosecond burst, I mean, this is unbelievably fast on a UV laser. That's pretty phenomenal. Now, one of the interesting one of the things we know from the burns on the cloth is that the burns are the result of heat. So when you look at the shroud in ultraviolet light, the burns fluoresce because they are caused by heat. Now, it's been said that the image may be the result of a scorch of some kind, like wrapped around some kind of a statue or a bas relief type thing. Mm-hmm. And it's and it was heated up and it was caused by heat. Here's the problem, is that the image does not fluoresce. The burns do. The image does not. So the image is not the result of heat. It may look like a scorch, but it's not a scorch. Now, one of the interesting things about this laser experiment is that they were able to recreate the depth and coloration of the shroud, and with very minimal heat. And so it's like, that's pretty interesting. Maybe we're onto something here. And but as far as someone being able to fully replicate the entire shroud image with all of its characteristics, nobody's done that.
Yeah, there's definitely been several attempts at it. And when you say fluoresce, you're referring to basically the glow that happens sort of when you shine UV light onto something. It then reflects back visual light.
Apparently, when you burn something, it releases different elements, aluminum, magnesium, and all these different things get kind of, broken apart molecularly, if you will, and they give off a kind of light. They were, like you say, like a reflection. But we don't, and we see it with the burns because they're obviously the result of heat. We don't see it with the image.
That's so fascinating. I'll have to look into that study. What was the source for that study? Do you remember what that one was?
Paulo de Lazzaro. He is the physicist who published that in 2011. So you just like Google, laser Shroud of Turin, you'll find it.
Paulo de Lazzaro. Okay, yeah, I'll definitely check that out. I'll link it in the description. I often hear people, especially Christians on the Protestant side generally, they are hesitant to accept it as authentic because they think it's sort of maybe a reflection of idolatry, right? Because you're worshiping an image of God rather than actually worshiping God himself. Exodus 24, it says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image of any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." They might say, "Oh, it says carved there," but generally it's graven image, right? Any sort of image that is
graven, meaning man-made. So,
yes.
And that's interesting because, from the earliest centuries, from the 6th century on, the shroud has been described as the true likeness of Christ, not made by human hands. And so they're very precise to say, we didn't do this. Don't blame us. We're not responsible for the crafting of this image. And it's in being mindful of the second commandment. I mean, it's pretty clear what the second commandment was about when Moses comes down from the mount and there's his brother Aaron having crafted a golden calf, as if that represents anything in heaven. And here they are dancing around it, worshiping a golden calf. And of course, Moses gets pretty ticked off about that. throws down the stone tablets, breaks them. Fast forward to the New Testament, God is made manifest in the person of his Son. And it's right from the first chapter of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God, and there wasn't anything made that wasn't made through the Word. And then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father. So clearly, the glory of God is revealed in the person of his Son. So what was not allowed to be seen in the Old Testament is seen by everyone in the New Testament in the person of Jesus, and when God is manifest as a human being. And it's even in 2 Corinthians somewhere it says that the glory of God is revealed in the face of Jesus. And so I think it's obviously something dramatically changed between Old Testament and New. And so, in fact, you have images of Jesus painted on the catacomb walls that go all the way back to the late first century, early second century. So, I think it's pretty much human nature that, the scripture gives you the name, Shroud gives you the face. You want to put a name and a face together. I don't think it's idolatry at all. I think it's just kind of natural. And where do you think we get our modern understanding of how Jesus looks like? Long hair, full beard, large hollow eyes, long flattened nose, stylistically looking exactly what we see on the shroud. And that goes all the way back to the 6th century to what was then known as the true likeness. And all your icon images of Jesus changed to conform to what it was then known as the true likeness of Christ. And it even instructs today. Why do you think Jonathan Romy looks the way he does on The Chosen? You're not going to have a picture. You're not going to have a short-haired Jesus hanging in your house anywhere. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, no, he's got that luscious locks. It's a beautiful look. It's pretty cool.
It works for him.
Yeah. You brought up a good point though, which I think is the idea that, God has made himself manifest, right? The incarnation itself is an image of God. Like, yes, God in human form is both God and man, but you can't ignore that, Jesus is man, he's both in Christian doctrine. And so that is an image, right? Right there. And to say that, you can't, when he says like, you can't make a graven image, as you mentioned before too, that's a human making the image rather than sort of God creating the image. So if the shroud is, made by God, then that would also be another maybe argument in favor of that too.
Yeah, Paul describes Jesus as the image of the invisible God. That's pretty clear. In another place, he describes Jesus as the express representation of the Father. I mean, so it's the Father made visible. Jesus says, if you can't, that if you can't believe that I'm in the Father and the Father is in me, at least believe on the evidence of the miracles themselves.
Some will point to the fact that the shroud is so similar to our depictions of our moderns or depictions of Jesus that it almost seems kind of odd. And maybe that's kind of a point of like, are we really supposed to, expect that the shroud would look like how we perceive Jesus to be in our modern day? Or does it reflect, medieval period depictions of Jesus? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, now you're going to go back to the artist. It's not the work of an artist. That's the problem. Is that, you're looking for an artist who is capable of crafting this astonishing image without the use of any known artistic substances, nor with the use of any known artistic technique. And it's and he crafted it in such a way as to kind of mimic or mirror our cultural understanding of what Jesus looked like. And it's no, I don't buy that argument. I think the shroud instructed how we art. I don't think the art instructed the shroud.
I see. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm skeptical of the shroud personally, and I find a lot of the arguments intriguing. So I'm kind of on this journey here, kind of like, okay, what's going on here? Uh, but when it comes to like the fact that it does sort of represent sort of our modern depictions of Jesus, that does kind of raise some red flags in my head. It's like, are we really supposed to expect that we actually got the image of Jesus perfect and that it represents the
Oh, I don't
shroud?
think anything's perfect because,
Mm-hmm.
the shroud has photographic type qualities to it, but it's not a photograph. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's for instance, in 1898 when they photographed it for the very first time, that's when this negative image was revealed. And how is it possible that the shroud looks so much clearer, so much more lifelike in a photo negative? And
Mm-hmm.
it's and this phenomenon is what launched the shroud into the realm of scientific investigation at the beginning of the 20th century. And we're still investigating it now. And
Yeah.
it's and the fact that it has three-dimensional qualities to it. It seems to contain distance information. In other words, it seems to correlate with how a cloth would have draped a three-dimensional body. Again, I come back to the superficiality of the image and the fact that it penetrates the cloth 1 to 2 microfibers uniformly throughout the entire cloth.
Mm-hmm.
You need a piece of technology to do that. You can't do that by wrapping it around a statue or anything else. Some kind of a dust rubbing, some kind of a bas relief hot, some kind of heat generated thing. We've done all those experiments, and they all fail.
In terms of the fact that we don't know what the mechanism is, that doesn't like automatically mean, it's a miracle. It just means that we don't know. So that's kind of my perspective on it. It could be that, Jesus rose from the dead, but I would, lean to favor more kind of a naturalistic explanation, simply because that's what normally occurs physically.
Well, if a
And so
natural
just because I guess what I'm just saying here is like, just because we don't know doesn't mean there isn't a natural explanation.
it would
So,
almost be more likely to be the work of an artist than a naturalistic explanation. Because if you're looking for a
yeah.
naturalistic explanation, then number one, burial shrouds around the world have all been examined. There's nothing that has an image on it that is even remotely comparable to the shroud.
Mm-hmm.
And corpses make smudges; they don't make images.
Yeah. No,
You know,
I think I actually agree with you on that point. When I said natural, I meant artist or someone
oh,
crafting
okay.
it or natural, but I think probably naturalistic meaning like using natural kind of physics to sort of create it in
Yeah,
some way.
yeah,
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying, but at the moment, all that's been ruled out, and it's and you kind of have to, go with the science. And what is the science saying? We have a tremendous body of data already collected on the shroud. It's
Yeah.
like go back to the data and see what the data says. It's and it's so right now I don't see that it could be the fabrication of an artist.
I would like to hear some of your thoughts on the radiocarbon dating of the Shroud of Turin. It was carbon dated in 1988, and it was carbon dated by 3 different laboratories: Oxford, Arizona, and I'm forgetting what the third one
Zurich.
was. Zurich. That's right. Their kind of collected data gave a range. They say 95% probability. A lot of people speculate they don't think it's quite 95%, but they gave that in the paper. The analysis of that dated it to the 13th and 14th century. I believe it's 1260 to 1390 from the radiocarbon dating. There's a lot of analysis that's happened since, but I'd love to hear kind of what are your thoughts and what have been some of kind of the pushback on the radiocarbon dating in 1988.
There was a protocol on how it was supposed to be dated, that was put together in 1986 and called for the cutting of multiple samples from multiple different locations on the cloth. But when the time came in 1988, they didn't do that. They cut one sample from the outside corner edge, exactly where the cloth had been held and handled hundreds of times over the centuries. I'm talking about people standing up on platforms out in the royal courtyard, holding it up with their hands horizontally so that the people down below could get a glimpse of it and venerate it and analyze it. And they would hold the cloth up manually by hand for hours upon hours upon hours, and changing people you'd have different people would be allowed to come up and hold it, because who wouldn't want the opportunity to hold the burial shroud that wrapped Jesus in the tomb? And so this was done hundreds of times, 275 times that we know of, from 1413 to 1696, I believe. And it's so you're gonna cut your one sample from the most handled part of the cloth, and it's like saying, what could go wrong? I mean, and so now,
can you explain why would handling affect the carbon dating?
I just think I'll get to that in just a second. Wear and tear and deterioration, contamination, and it's so now Ray Rogers, thermal chemist with the Los Alamos National Laboratory, he suspects that maybe there's something awry with that corner, and so he obtains a thread sample from the middle of the sample that was cut. There were three little postage stamp size samples that were sent to the labs, and one larger sample was held back as a reserve sample. Well, he obtained a thread from the middle of the reserve sample, compared it with a thread from the main body of the shroud. They're not the same. And so, in other words, there appears to be cotton mixed in with the flax in that corner, yet there's no cotton anywhere else on the shroud. There appears to be some kind of some kind of what's called a madder root dye, MADDER, madder root dye on the cloth in that corner, perhaps maybe to blend in the brighter, newer cotton threads. And there's a presence of starch to stiffen the threads to affect some kind of repair. So it appears that we have all the ingredients for some kind of a medieval reweave or some kind of a medieval repair. And that's okay. But the problem is, if that's the only place where you took your sample from and you have no other place on the shroud to compare it with, that's a problem. And so now we have very little confidence in terms of what they actually dated. The British Museum oversaw the whole carbon dating effort, and they collected the data from the three labs, submitted it to Nature, which is a British journal, published in 1989. But what's interesting is that Nature did not publish, the British Museum did not give to Nature all of the raw data. They selected their data. Lo and behold, when you add in the data that was excluded from the original report, it is clear that sample is not homogeneous. In other words, it is not fully representative of the entire shroud. And had they used all of the raw data, their article would have never been published. And that's why they excluded certain data to get to their 95% confidence level, which, everyone who publishes a report has to say with 95% confidence, And so carbon dating, the whole dating thing is quite the fiasco, because they violated the sampling protocol. And as I would say to a fifth grader, how many of you know that cutting one sample into three pieces is not the same as taking three different samples? Well, fifth graders know, but apparently they didn't.
There's two things you brought up. You mentioned that it might be like a reweaving. So basically, they would have added some repair with cotton threads in that corner. And so that would be messing with the carbon dating, making it appear to be newer than it actually is. And then you mentioned the other one, which is the degree of certainty, kind of not passing out all the information in order to give that sort of 95% certainty.
Well, when you fudge your data, that gives your whole project kind of a bad smell.
But does it make the entire, I guess, data null and void? Because I guess I don't know if I'd say that quite adds up. Like just because there's some data that's missing, and then when you add it in, it doesn't quite fully agree. But like, does that automatically make it like first century? You know what I mean? Like just because it doesn't quite add up.
I don't know. I at this point you got to go to the historians and see what the historical trail looks like, because I think it's pretty plain that the shroud has a historical origin that far predates the 1260 date range, 1260 to 1390.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things that seem to be referring to a shroud or a head covering, which we see in John's gospel, that it's not just the shroud, but there's also the head covering as well. And so there seems to be a lot of sort of historical precedent to potentially say, yeah, maybe the shroud's older than this. There's been a recent new document found regarding I think his name's Nicole Orisme, and it confirms the 14th century date. We can get to that in maybe just a moment, but I'd love to hear more on like what are some of these historical evidences that sort of back up the shroud being older than what people suggest.
I have a quote ready for you.
Perfect.
And let me read.
We love quotes on this channel.
So let's talk about the Fourth Crusade for a minute. The Fourth Crusade was authorized by Pope Innocent III to send the Crusaders down to the Holy Land to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. And the Crusaders had done a deal with the Doge, or the Duke of Venice, to build a whole fleet of sailing ships to sail the Crusaders down to Egypt, and from Egypt they would march on foot to modern day Israel. So what happened though is that the Doge fulfilled his part of the bargain, built all these ships, but the Crusaders, who promised 80,000 men, only came up with 30,000, and along with men comes money. So if you're short 50,000 men, you're going to be short a commensurate amount of money to pay for these ships. Now, unfortunately for Constantinople, they had allowed some of the Latin Crusaders, to walk through the city and get just full of lust over all of the wealth that they saw in front of them, all the gold, silver, all the relics, and so then word leaked out. And so, anyways, this began the war to basically invade Constantinople, burn down half the buildings. They stole everything of value, all the silver, all the gold, all the ivory, and all of the relics associated with the saints, and that were all ripped off and stolen in the space of 3 days. As you can imagine, the Pope Innocent III did not authorize this, and he was pretty unhappy. Now, what also disappeared in this 3 days of pillage and plunder was the shroud, which was kept in St. Mary's of Blachernae, which is a section of Constantinople, and it was last seen. There's a report of it there by a crusader, a chronicler by the name of Robert de Clary, who documents the fact that this linen shroud was on display there, and it was exhibited every Friday. One of the crusaders had control of that section of Constantinople, Blachernae, and his name was Othon de la Roche. Now, Othon absconds with the shroud and a bunch of other stuff and heads back to Athens. What I'm going to read you now is a quote from the brother of the emperor. This is written in 1205. It says, "In April of last year, the crusading army, having falsely set out to liberate the Holy Land, instead laid waste the city of Constantine. During the sack, troops of Venice and France looted even the holy sanctuaries. The Venetians partitioned the treasures of gold, silver, and ivory, while the French did the same with the relics of the saints, and, most sacred of all, the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death and before the resurrection. We know that the sacred objects are preserved by their predators or their thieves in Venice, in France, and other places, the sacred linen in Athens. So now we know that this shroud was taken to Athens, obviously by Othon, because Athens was his fiefdom. He was the Duke of Athens. He eventually moves back to Burgundy, France, which is where he's from. We have trail around 1225, and then it goes cold. So all this stuff goes underground, including the shroud, which is what gives rise to the so-called missing years, which is kind of in between 1225 or so and 1350. Well, in 1350, we have another history. The shroud pops up in history again, and it's the property of Jeanne de Vergy. And who is Jeanne de Vergy? Well, she's the great-great-great-granddaughter of Othon de la Roche. So obviously this cloth was kept in the family. So then Jeanne de Vergy, she meets Geoffrey de Charnay, who is the famous knight who has the possession of the shroud. Well, she marries Geoffrey. We believe that she gives the shroud to Geoffrey as part of her dowry. So Jeanne, she makes plans where she commissions a copy of the shroud to be painted. And this painted copy she'd send it back to Besançon as a consolation prize. Now, Henry de Poitiers, he was the bishop at Troyes, and he does an investigation because he's got to get to the bottom of this thing with the shroud, because it's attracting pilgrims from all over the place, and nobody's going to Troyes. I mean, who wants to see the arm of St. James when you can see the whole body of Jesus? You know, it's so now he allegedly finds the artist who painted the shroud, interrogates him, finds out how he did it. It was cunningly painted on plain cloth. Well, we got a problem because it appears that we're talking of two different objects here, because what we know about the Shroud of Turin is that it's not a plain cloth. It's a very distinctive 3-to-1 herringbone pattern weave, very expensive, doable in first century, but you're using first century loom technology, but it's expensive and therefore rare. No one would ever describe the shroud as being plain cloth. Secondly, we also know that it was not cunningly painted. We've been through this. There are no artistic substances on the cloth. So it seems that are we talking about the same cloth here? And what I think here is that we have the artist who was interrogated by Henry de Poitiers was obviously the artist who painted the copy that was sent back to Besançon. And so then now you have Erasmus, who's making a big claim, about fake relics and things like this, and the shroud being Exhibit A, not realizing that what was investigated by Henry de Poitiers, that's what he's basing it on, wasn't even the shroud. It was a copy that was sent back to Besançon. That's the only way that you can reconcile these things. And so it wasn't a very thorough investigation. The artist was never identified. The technique used was never described. There was no quote ever given in terms of his interrogation. It's all hearsay. And this is the same information that Bishop Darcis used in 1389, again, quoting Henry de Poitiers and his alleged interrogation. So Darcis adds nothing to it. And then Erasmus, wherever his name is. Are
you talking about Nicole Arisme?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Again, I mean, I don't have a problem with Nicholas's premise, is that, he's kind of a naturalist, he's kind of a rationalist, he doesn't want things supernatural that ascribe to that which is not supernatural. And I totally understand that, but his denigration of the shroud was based entirely on Henry de Portier's investigation of the artist who obviously painted the copy that was sent back to Besançon.
Mm-hmm. So that was kind of a lot of history. If I'm getting you right, correct me where I misunderstand you. You're saying we have record of it dating to the Fourth Crusade in the early 1300s, and through that process there was a
and it would be
crusader
1204.
who
It would be
1204. Okay, and there was a crusader who ended up with the shroud at the end of the crusade. He passes it on to his descendants, who is what her name was Jean or
Jean de Vergy.
Jean de Vergy. So the descendant of the crusader, Jean de Vergy, she ends up in the possession of it, and she gives it to
Geoffrey de Charnay.
Geoffrey, yeah, because I always read it as Joffrey, so that's good. I'm glad that you corrected me. Geoffrey de Charnay. And the Charnay family, every historian out there agrees that's where we for sure know the Shroud of Turin started, with Geoffrey de Charnay, the Charnay family. For sure.
When you would say it started in Champagne, France, because it was certainly exhibited in Besançon as well, but it was obviously pretty quiet at that point.
What I'm saying though, like, pretty well everyone agrees that that's the case. Like that the Charnay family started, like, had it. Before that, what you're saying is Jean. I always forget her name. What was it again? Jean. Okay, so she gives the shroud to Geoffrey de Charnay, and that's the first, right? Geoffrey de Charnay the first. He displays it at his church, and the Pope at the time, the anti-Pope, technically, he's the Pope of France and a few other areas. He's the one that basically says you can't, show this anymore because of what some of the bishops were saying.
Right.
So he takes it down, and that's kind of the beginning of our understanding of the Shroud of Turin. Did I summarize that correct?
That's close. It's okay. They in 1389, Geoffrey's son, de Charnay II, he, along with Jean, his mother, who was still alive, they wanted to exhibit it again, and that got Bishop Darcis all in a fluster, because that was the same year that the roof of his church at Troyes collapsed, and in 1389, and then 1390 the rose window collapsed, and so now how are they going to get the money to rebuild this church if everyone's going to Loret to see the shroud? And it's so there was obviously a clear political monetary motive to discredit it. Then they came back and said, okay, you can exhibit it, but only if you may say that it's a representation, that it's not the real deal. And they said, okay, fine, we'll just call it a representation. And then Darcis got upset, because even as they displayed it as a representation, they were elevating it and having all of the ceremony as though it was the authentic shroud. And he says, and he was mad that they were duping the pilgrims into believing that it was the authentic shroud, even though they were saying statements that it's only a representation. And again, the whole thing, in my opinion, is mired in just politics and money. And it's and you better believe that Darcis or Henry de Poitiers would have been happy to exhibit the shroud at their cathedral in Troyes, but such is not the case.
I mean, definitely politics and money corrupt a whole lot of things. So I'm not surprised for that kind of history to be surrounding the Shroud of Turin.
So I got to tell you something. Now, there's another quote I want to show you. When you talk about history, you got to go all the way back. And I know that one of the arguments that Oresme uses, as well as John Calvin, which is, well, I mean, you'd think that something as significant as Jesus leaving an image on his burial shroud, that would warrant a mention in the gospel somewhere. And it's, but that's not really a reasonable argument, because you have to look at the whole tenor of the times. Is that
I have the quote here real quick.
Okay.
So I can read it. From Bishop Pierre d'Arcis, he says, "It is not likely that the holy evangelists would have kept silent or omitted it, nor that it would have remained secret or hidden up to this time." And that's in reference to not just the burial cloth, but the burial cloth with an image on it. So there it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
You continue.
So, now we have to realize that, okay. So when you look at the gospel narrative from John, especially, Mary goes to the tomb early in the morning, sees that the stone has been rolled aside from the entrance, sees that the body's gone, runs to find the apostles, and says, "Someone has taken our Lord's body out of the tomb, and I don't know where they put him." So she thinks the body's been stolen, which, just as an aside, that's proof that the empty tomb by itself is not enough to prove the resurrection, because it didn't convince Mary. Peter and John run back down to the tomb. John gets there first, waits for Peter. Peter gets there, goes straight inside the tomb, sees the linen cloth lying there. Then John goes in. He also notices the cloth lying there and believes. Believes what? Well, believes that he had risen. I mean, that was the rumor throughout all of Jerusalem. That's why it's the rumor that Jesus himself started, that on the third day he'd rise again. And and it's why they had the band of Roman soldiers placed outside in front of the tomb to keep someone from stealing the body and claiming a resurrection, right? So it's interesting now. So John becomes the first of the apostles to believe in the resurrection, and that belief is based on the evidence of the linen cloth lying there. I think that's pretty significant. In 42, they killed James. They tried to kill Peter. They arrested him with the intent of killing him the very next day. I mean, there was massive persecution going on. You're not at all going to write anything that would say, "Oh, and Peter has the shroud. It's in the trunk of his car." I mean, no one's going to, overtly clarify this or where this image is, or this cloth, or even if it has an image, because you would set off a search and destroy mission to find it and destroy it. And it's so either on the part of the Romans or the Jews. And so I don't.
You think the Romans and Jews would want to destroy the shroud? Why do you think that?
If they're trying to destroy this early Christianity, because that was that's your evidence right there. The empty cloth. It's again, the empty tomb is not enough. The empty tomb was not what convinced John that he had risen. It was the linen cloth lying there. That was the first piece of evidence. Because an empty tomb, you could easily say, well, the body was stolen. And well, it clearly wasn't stolen because the linen cloth was left there. Now, there's a quote I want to mention to you. This is from the 6th century, and this is what's called the Mozarabic Rite of Holy Week. It's liturgy that is brought to Spain by a group of Arab Catholics, and they translate John chapter 20, verse 5 and 6 this way. Peter ran with John to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. Well, now that's interesting. Now, that's not how our scripture is translated, but that's how they chose to translate John chapter 25 and 6. Why would they do that unless it was based on something that they were aware of, something that they had knowledge of, something that they had even seen? Because that's pretty specific.
When does that date to? when that was when
Sixth
that
century.
translation.
I'm not sure the exact date, but it's right around the 6th century.
Okay.
And it's so that's pretty huge.
Yeah, to compare it with like our modern translations, John 5-6 says, he bent over and looked at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there.
Well, the strips translation is kind of unfortunate in the English language. It's Athonia is the word in Greek. It just means more than one cloth. It's a plural term for cloth. And so there might have been, we certainly know there was a face covering, which probably is the Sudarium of Oviedo, Spain. Mm-hmm. And most likely, as Jesus gave up his spirit, now he's hanging on the cross. He's dead. He's got blood coming down everywhere. His face has been punched, has been beaten. He's got pleural effusion coming out of his mouth and his nose. Just a complete mess. And one of the women probably said, "May we cover his face?" And said, "Yeah, go ahead and be quick about it." So he put a little step stool up to the cross and step up there and wrap this cloth around the face, pin it in the back. And this cloth would have stayed on his face until they got him to the side of the tomb, a couple 100 feet away. I'm not sure. It's not that far. Then they got Jesus into the tomb, laid him onto the burial shroud itself, remove that cloth, roll it up, place it next to the body because they had blood on it. Anything with blood on it had to stay with the body. And then take the top portion of the cloth and drape it over him lengthwise. And that's about all they had time to do, because that was on Friday. It was the Sabbath was almost upon them. So, and we're talking about Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were the ones that buried the body of Jesus. So that cloth, if you see the Sudarium of Oviedo, there's no image on it. It's just a mess of some blood, but mostly pleural effusion.
This is it here. Obviously, we're looking at the actual image itself, but I mean, if you look at it, different types of pictures, it becomes a little bit more clear. But yeah, it's the face cloth of Jesus, essentially the supposed face burial cloth with the blood and all of that as well.
So what's interesting is that John then becomes the first of the apostles to believe of the resurrection based on the evidence of the linen cloth lying there. Now, Acts chapter 1, verse 3 says this: after his suffering, he showed himself to be alive through many convincing proofs. Now, most all those were post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. But the first proof was the linen cloth lying there in the tomb. Was that only for the benefit of Peter and John? Or was it for the benefit of the whole world, throughout all generations? So it doesn't surprise me that the cloth was quickly scurried out of Jerusalem to preserve it. Jews didn't know what to do with it because it touched a corpse. It was covered with blood. It's doubly unclean. But at the same time, you don't want to discard the last thing Jesus wore on earth. Let's just give it to the Gentiles and let them figure out what to do with it. And so it was, it was scurried to ancient Edessa, and from there it remained there for about 900 years until it was taken to Constantinople in 944. It makes sense to me to bring it to Edessa because it was outside the reaches of the Roman Empire. And it was its own city-state. And King Abgar V, he became a fervent believer in Jesus because, so now we have a believing king. That seems like maybe a safe place to bring this cloth.
Yeah, I've seen a little bit on the reference to it being in Edessa, and there's a lot of references to this sort of like image of Jesus from there. I'm personally skeptical, okay, just because there's sort of an image of Jesus in Edessa, how do we know that's the Shroud of Turin? What are some of the things kind of linking these two?
Well, that's where you get into the true likeness, and you see all the representations in ancient art based on the cloth that was in Edessa, and you see how they correlate with what we see on the shroud.
My thought on that is, well, we probably just have this sort of general depiction, this sort of modern depiction of who Jesus looked like, and that's could have gotten like it could be that it is the actual shroud, but it could also just be that they used this, general understanding of what Jesus looked like to create the shroud in that way. And I know you don't think it's an artisan who created it, based upon kind of how we've studied it.
Now you're looking for an artist back in the 6th century, and it's so that even makes it.
Well, I wouldn't say 6th century. I'd say that they could use what was known from the 6th century to create it in the 14th century.
Now we're down to the either or proposition, because if it's not authentic, then it must be the work of human effort, and now the burden's back on people to say, okay, you say it's 14th century, then tell us who did it. There's no artist identified. There's no process or technique that we can determine. There's no substances that were used. We've eliminated some of the other things, like a dust rubbing or a hot statue. All that's been eliminated. So now we're down to, okay, we want to claim it's a natural cause, but now it's like, okay, well, what?
Mm-hmm. Again, I get back to, just because we can't say what the natural cause is doesn't mean we know that it's a miracle. Like there's a difference between like saying we don't know what the natural cause is and then saying it's a miracle. Because if you're saying it's a miracle, then you have to back that up, because that's a claim right there. You see what I mean? Like, to me, it's sort of like the natural cause makes the most sense because it's natural, right? If it's supernatural, then that's where you have to have the burden of proof to kind of back up that claim. Does that kind of make sense?
Well, it does, but there are other things involved, because what do we know about what happened to Jesus in the tomb? I mean, who knows what a resurrection looks like? I told you about that whole laser technology of a 40 nanosecond burst on a UV laser. Well, probably the best description of what happened to Jesus in the tomb comes from the Apostle Paul, who writes in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 52. He says, "Behold, I show you a mystery. We will not all sleep." That means to remain dead. But we will all be changed. How? In the twinkling of an eye, in a flash. At the last trump. And it's talking about how the perishable must put on imperishable, and the corruptible must put on incorruptible. So here Paul is talking about this transformational, instantaneous event in a twinkling of an eye, in a flash. And here we have this really intriguing, laser experiment showing how a 40 nanosecond flash, replicates what we see on the shroud. I think, is that what we're talking about? I think it's something to consider.
Okay, yeah.
And then the fact that you have a whole pattern of blood stains, but there's no image under the blood, which tells us that the blood was there first, followed by the image, that also correlates with the whole biblical account. It's not blood that was painted there by some alleged artist. It's called the exudate of wounds. And what we see are blood components. We see bile, we see serum albumin, hemoglobin, we see bilirubin. Bilirubin's really interesting. There's a high content of bilirubin. That is it is a breakdown component of red blood cells that occurs during conditions of severe stress. Well, I think crucifixion might qualify. So now, but even more than that, and this was published recently too by a blood chemist who trained at Johns Hopkins. When you look at the blood stains under ultraviolet light, there is this serum contraction ring that you can see around every blood stain. And the only way that we can replicate it, you have the body all bloodied up, and you have the blood partially clotted on the body, and then laid onto the shroud, and that's how you get blood stains that will have this serum contraction ring. And so what that also perfectly corresponds to what we see in the whole gospel account, is that Jesus was probably dead for maybe 45 minutes or so prior to when he was removed from the cross and then taken to the tomb. So you have all these blood stains from all the scourges and everything else are in the process of partially clotting, and then wrapped in it. And when the body would not have been washed, it would have been against Jewish law to wrap a body that was subjected to violent death. You just wrap it in a plain cloth called a sovev, which means to wrap around or go around. And that's what we see on the shroud.
Yeah, there definitely seems to be a lot of correlations, especially between like what we see depicted in the like gospel accounts and what we see on the shroud. One thing people bring up, which has, I believe, been debunked. There's some people that bring up they've found traces of red ochre paint on the cloth. That whole idea has been debunked because we've looked closer at the blood, and while there was red ochre found on the cloth, there seems to be more evidences that this is actually blood. Like it's not just red ochre, but there's also actual blood.
Yeah. There's there's a lot of confusion over that. First of all, there are paint particles on the shroud. There's also found a particle of nylon. So what does that mean? That was invented by DuPont in 1930. I mean, so there's paint particles on the shroud, but they're randomly distributed. And you can understand it's been exhibited inside ornate cathedrals for hundreds of years, and plus there are over 50 known copies of the shroud, painted copies. And there's a whole photo documentation of all these copies. They're all horrible, but their only saving grace is the fact they were all touched to the original shroud, therefore sanctified. It's like getting a baseball card signed by Babe Ruth, right? And so, but anytime you're going to touch a painted copy to the original, there's going to be a translocation of paint particles. And so, yeah, we see random particles, but nothing in the image areas to account for the image, and that's the main event. What accounts for the image? Walter McCrone, all of his claims have been debunked. He was lazy. He just looked at the particles through the mylar tape using his polarizing light microscope. And it's
can you explain the tape real quick, the mylar tape?
They took tape samples all over the cloth. They applied tape to the cloth, pull up that tape, stuck to the tape will be a sampling of dirt, dust, insect parts, fibers, pollen, all kinds of stuff. And so he analyzed on these tapes, he was looking for, this, what he called iron oxide, because he thought that the image was the result of this jeweler's rouge. This was alleged to be an iron oxide solution suspended in a thin binder solution. Well, anyways, so he's looking for iron oxide, and he sees two indexes of refraction. Aha! I've found my iron oxide. It's not blood at all. And so now these tapes are given to John Heller and Al Adler, two blood chemists, and they painstakingly took days to remove the particles from the tape, and then dissolve the glue from the tape from all these particles, and then they began to look at them, and guess what? They're non-birefringent. They're not birefringent at all, as McCrone had said. In other words, it's blood. And they even they had several solutions that they to dissolve the blood into, and it dissolves. Iron oxide won't dissolve, and so they proved that McCrone, because he was lazy, he didn't pull the particles off from the mylar tape the way they did. He came to a false conclusion, is because the tape itself was giving that second index of refraction.
No, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned something earlier too about the serum. They found like a serum from the blood on the cloth. I think that's a very important point. I'm going to pull up a picture here real quick. Sorry for any of the audio listeners. Perhaps you can watch this one on YouTube later or something along the lines. But so right here is a picture of it's the hands.
Yeah,
so
it's the wrist. Mm-hmm.
Or the wrists, I should say. Yeah, the wrists that were nailed. They kind of like laid in a form, kind of like this, but backwards, obviously. So at the very tip here, there's a little light kind of coloring. You see the darker kind of coloring of the image. Here's the blood, and then this is the serum, I believe, is what you're referring to.
Serum contraction ring. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is the image of the same wound, but in reflectant, kind of normal light,
right,
versus ultraviolet light right here, and it shows this serum. And the serum, from what I'm familiar with, is kind of like plasma. It's like the clear part of your blood. So if you go and you donate plasma, you're going and you're donating the clear part, the serum of your blood. And the reason why this is important is because it shows that it's real blood. It's not just merely like paint, but it shows that it has the properties of blood, and that the serum is showing up in this area. The process is a capillary action. So like if you've ever taken like a napkin and dipped it in water, you notice how the water will like rise to a further part up the cloth, the napkin than just the part that you dipped in the water. It's a similar process here. So like underneath the wound, due to gravity, the blood's going to pool and separate the blood from the serum. And the only part that's going to be attached to the cloth through capillary action, through that process of kind of defying gravity, is that serum portion. The rest of the blood's not going to do the same kind of thing. This is real blood. We're not talking about, paint or anything along those lines.
And the thing that was come out recently with that blood specialist who trained at Johns Hopkins, is that serum contraction ring is only can we get that when the blood is in the process of partially clotting on the body and then laid onto the cloth. So in other words, if you take the body and the body's killed within minutes, put it in the cloth, then you have all this fresh blood flowing from. It's not going to do it. Not going to do it. It has to be in a process of partially clotting and then come in contact with the cloth. That's the only way we can replicate those serum rings, and which correlates perfectly with what happened to Jesus. He hung on the cross for how long? Maybe 45 minutes until he was finally taken to the tomb and then wrapped in the burial shroud. So it's consistent in that respect as well.
Another fascinating thing that people often bring up, we've only just barely talked about it, which is kind of surprising to me, but the fact that the image shows up more clear on the cloth when it is shown in the photo negative. In addition to that, it has sort of information on the cloth that helps us create a three-dimensional depiction of what the body would have looked like. So can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that? Like, why is that sort of significant? What are some of the interesting features in reference to this whole idea of the Shroud of Turin being a photo negative and also being three-dimensional in terms of some of its representation?
Well, the three-dimensional aspect simply means that it contains distance information. In other words, there are areas of the cloth or areas of parts of the body that would not have been in direct contact with the cloth, and yet the image is there except lighter. So what apparently the scientists call the shroud an areal density image, which means that where there's no variation in color on the shroud. It's a monochrome image. It's the same color throughout. But however, where it appears darker or lighter simply has to do with the number of microfibers affected by whatever caused the image. So where there's more microfibers affected, it's darker. Where there's fewer microfibers affected, it's lighter. So in other words, it has this distance information seems to be encoded into the image, which is kind of pretty remarkable. And it's which suggests
when you say distance information, what do you mean by that?
Well, in the fact that when that it appears to act like a topographical map, and it's so when they analyze the shroud initially, a very primitive computer now, but a VP8 image analyzer that just assigns elevation based on dark and light. When they scan a picture of the shroud, it just comes out in 3-dimensional contour, and so. This was really the catalyst for the Shroud Project to get together and say, hey, we need to get to the bottom of this. This shouldn't be happening. And then as far as the photonegativity is concerned, that's the photonegative on the right. The
original and photonegative. Yeah.
The image appears so much more lifelike in the photonegative. And the question is why? Is it this knowledge of this negative image was completely unknown to any alleged medieval artist or forger. So now we have to believe that this is just a natural byproduct of some kind of hoax that they were perpetrating, and they had no knowledge that it was going to end up as a photo negative with distance information. As they say, I don't think it passes the smell test. I mean, it's like I'm just.
So with the photo negative, though, it's measuring kind of the distance between the body and the cloth itself, right? So like,
well, the 3-dimensional, the distance information.
That would be the photo negative, though, too, because if it's because a photo negative, it just reverses the coloring, right? So anything that's like
it reverses
dark,
your light values,
yeah. So anything that's like darker in the image is going to be lighter in a photo negative, and anything lighter in an image is going to be darker. So if, say, an image is based upon the distance between like the body and the cloth, then the parts that are close to the cloth, like your nose, are going to show up darker. Right. And then the parts further away, like your eye sockets, are going to show up lighter. Well, when you reverse the coloring, right, the parts that are darker, like your nose, are going to be lighter. And then the parts that are lighter are going to be darker, like your eyes. And that sort of correlates to the idea of a photo negative, that kind of distance quality.
Right. Right. And especially profound is how the blood looks, so, contrasted. Now what was once, reddish brown now looks white. And it's so it becomes really highly, highly contrasted. Oh, so
the blood shows up light as well?
Yeah, on the photo negative, all the marks around the head are all white. All those white marks around the head, those are all blood marks.
I showed this earlier too. This is the 3-dimensional kind of. You were talking about the NASA V8 technology that showed up the 3-dimensional aspect. We can kind of see the body's 3-dimensional here. These are the burn marks. So based on like the coloring, we kind of see, those weren't there, but the burn marks show up in the 3D image because it's based on the color. And then,
you see,
okay, I see. Yeah. Right here we see the white kind of blood marks. Okay, yeah, that's pretty fascinating. So what's the significance of the fact that the blood marks show up white?
Oh, the significance is only the fact that if we're gonna allege that this is the work of a medieval artist, then this was purely unknown to him. It was just an accidental byproduct, and that's and I think that's that's pretty amazing, since there's no other known art that we know of that has the same kind of phenomenon.
I guess my thought is, if it has the quality of like a photo negative, but that doesn't mean like it is a photo negative.
Correct.
It just means that like it has that sort of quality. And if we're thinking it was sort of created in a sort of distance mechanism where like the darker parts closest to the cloth are going to, show up in that way, and vice versa, then you'd expect it to have sort of a photo negative quality. That's at least my thought. Well, you mentioned the kind of medieval art, and I think one piece of art that people point to a lot is the Hungarian Prey Codex. So I'll pull that up. Could you maybe elaborate what is the Hungarian Prey Codex?
Hungarian Prey, it's called Hungarian Prey Manual, if you will. But yeah. it was the first book bound in the Hungarian language in 1192, and it was it had some various picture codexes in the book, and these pictures were drawn by an artist who was likely an eyewitness to the shroud in Constantinople somewhere between 1160 and 1170, because that's when King Bela III of Hungary, he served in the court of the emperor in Constantinople during that time. No doubt he had his artisans with him to kind of, document his time there. And so what we're looking at here is just scenes of Jesus, and it's in the top portion we see Jesus laid out onto his burial shroud, and then hands over the pelvis like we see on the shroud, 4 fingers, no thumbs, and then down on the bottom, which is the kind of the scene 2, we see Jesus wrapped in this long, narrow, rectangular cloth, enveloped lengthwise, the same way we see on the shroud. And I don't know if it's visible there, but there's an L-shaped. There we go. There's an L-shaped pattern of holes that he depicts, which is exactly a burn pattern that we see on the shroud that predated the 1532 fire. And there it is. There's an example of it. You go, and then you see all the zigzag lines there in that denotes the very distinctive 3-to-1 herringbone pattern weave of the shroud. And there's other similarities as well. So that's a pretty clear smoking gun, if you will, that the cloth that was in Constantinople is the same one that's in Turin, Italy today. It's especially those L-shaped pattern of 4 burn holes. That's exactly what we see on the shroud. There's no reason for them to be on this painting unless he was painting what we know today as the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting piece of artwork, and it dates to definitely before the carbon dating that we have. What was it again? I think it's the 12th century or something.
This was 1192 in which the book was bound, but these pictures were probably drawn earlier than that. And again, probably looking at 1160 to 1170 in that time frame. And the oldest carbon date is 1260. Mm-hmm. But bear in mind that this cloth that they're representing here, arrived in Constantinople in 944. So it didn't just get there. It had been there for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm. What's been in Constantinople for 900 years is the Shroud of Turin, not the codex, not the manuscript you're talking about. Okay. Correct. Yeah.
Is right, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So the codex is very fascinating to me. It seems to have very similar depictions to the Shroud of Turin itself. And I think it might be one of the better kind of things historically to point to the Shroud of Turin being older than what the...
Well, the thing is that if you link the shroud to 1204, then you've just jumped over the missing years. And it's now all of your allegations of it being crafted in 1350 completely fall apart. So all of the allegations of Henry de Poitiers and Pierre d'Arcis and Nicholas Oresme, they all fall apart.
I love your accent when you say their words. It's good. Pierre de Poitiers. Oh. We have to get some wine and cheese in here.
Mon Dieu.
I think the burn marks are very intriguing. Generally, people talk about how the body's like naked, and so that's kind of odd for a medieval depiction. Because
Yeah,
they
that's very important, is
yeah.
because on the shroud, Jesus is naked.
You said the four fingers though. When we look at the shroud, when we look at this one though, we also see that there's four fingers on most of the other people in the image too. So it could be because the thumb kind of behind the palm, but I also think it might just be the fact that that's what the artist does on
It could
this.
be a stylized motif, but at the same time, what becomes inescapable to me is number one, the L-shaped pattern of burns, the zigzag lines that correlate with the very distinctive 3-to-1 herringbone pattern weave, and what this is really important too is because there's no rule as to what kind of cloth someone needs to be buried in. I mean, you can buy a burial shroud on Amazon right now, and it costs you $300, and it's 6x9. But the shroud is a very unique 3.5 feet wide, 14 feet long. This is very unusual, and but long enough to envelop a 5'10" man lengthwise. Okay, and that's the exact same aspect ratio as we see on this Hungarian prayer manuscript, and I think that's not to be overlooked. I think that's pretty significant. But I always close with this: there are four words that are commonly used to describe what the shroud is. It's called a relic. It's called an artifact. It's called a mystery. It's called a symbol. And those words are fine, but they really don't tell you very much. So I got to thinking there has to be another idea, another concept. So I searched the scriptures for all the words that describe what Jesus accomplished for us on the cross. And there are four of them. As believers, we have been bought, purchased, redeemed, ransomed. What are those words? Those are all words of transaction. A transaction has occurred, a payment has been made on our behalf. And I got to thinking, well, when you go to a store and you purchase anything, you're making a transaction. When you give the money to the cashier, what does he or she always give you in return? A receipt. What is a receipt?
Okay.
It's a record of the transaction. What's on the receipt? The price you paid, right? So when Peter and John ran to the tomb and saw the linen cloth lying there, what did they see? They saw the record of the transaction. They saw the receipt. When they opened it up, what did they see? They saw evidence of a crown of thorns, scourging all over the body, wound in the side, nails in the wrist, nails in the feet, abrasions on the face. So in other words, everything that was paid to purchase our salvation is on the receipt. And so what does it mean? It means it's an itemized receipt documenting everything that was paid. Now, it's interesting that the very last word Jesus uttered from the cross is a Greek word, and that word is tetelestai. And it's usually translated as "it is finished," but it could also be translated as "paid in full." Same exact word. Maybe the shroud is a receipt, a document that says "paid in full."
Yeah, that's a really cool image. I like the depiction there. It kind of matches a lot of kind of westernized sort of depictions of salvation as this sort of judge who has let you free and paid the bail for the debt, the sin that you have incurred. So that's a cool kind of concept that, maybe Jesus left a receipt for us all to kind of see the actual itemized sort of things that he's paid for us for our debt.
I think so.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, Russ, thank you so much for being here. Where can people learn more about you and what you do?
Well, you can go to my website, which is shroudencounter.com, and everything you know about it is there. Also, I published a book last year. It's called Shroud Encounter, Explore the World's Greatest Unsolved Mystery. You can go to Amazon, pick that up, or on my website. Also, just put out a new book, very short, about 40 pages long, but lots of color images. And it's I just put it up a couple days ago. It's called Understanding the Shroud of Turin. That's on Amazon. And so if you want something short, sweet, and simple with lots of pictures, that's the book. And it's, if you want to get, learn, go a bit deeper, then get this one, Shroud Encounter. And even the price point on this one is not bad. It's only $18.95 on Amazon. The latest one I put up is like $9.99. I would have made it cheaper, but Amazon won't let me. So it's like it's like $10, but it's got all color images in it, and I think you really enjoy it. So
yeah, I'll link that in the description, and people can check that out. So I'm excited to dig into more of this. I plan on releasing a few videos, kind of getting deeper and deeper into this subject, and you are the introduction of the Shroud of Turin to my audience. So I appreciate your time here.
Thanks, Jackson. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this conversation with Russ Breault. Be sure to give this video a like or a 5-star rating if you are listening to it on a podcast app. Additionally, I would appreciate it if you would consider sending me a tip at my Buy Me a Coffee site linked below. Every tip goes directly toward improving the show. That's buymeacoffee.com/truth_tradition or the link in the description down below. As always, I'd like to end things off with a quote from Mark Orwell. Perhaps the real mystery of the Shroud of Turin, regardless of whether it's authentic or forged, lies in its profound allure through the generations and across the centuries, calling to something deep within us. Go, stay curious, and be blessed.